Well, it is actually an honor and a great pleasure to be with all of you today. This is an incredibly important time and a critical meeting for the world, for all of your children. We certainly know learning is changed. It has changed. It has changed for your citizens, your people, certainly your students and families. What hasn't changed, or at least hasn't changed as much, is education, our schools, our foundation for our institutions to support the learning that has changed around our students and our families' lives. And it's critical for us to not only bridge that gap, but do so quickly as we face not only great conversations today, but great change and potential change in the future. And that's what this is about. I love the fact that this plenary session and the plenary sessions have been designed around questions. What drives success? And in many ways, the questions we ask in education, and as we go about embracing the change potential that is before us, are far more important than the actions that we take. In many cases, rooting our progress, our success in rich questions will drive us forward. So asking a question, what drives success, is perfect. First off, let's look at success. Defining what success means is critical. And I often get asked as I travel around the world, what is a successful school to you? What does a successful school look like? And it's hard for me to define that easily because I know it when I see it. But typically it comes back to one basic thing. The kids in the school, the children in the school, expect a big future ahead for themselves. And that's not often easy to achieve. It's one of the things that we often undervalue. And when students walk into a classroom, do they expect more from their future? When they walk into the school, do they feel powered to make change possible, to have a bigger role in their communities, with their families, in their country, and in the world? And we've got to embrace our school systems to create an engine for success. And that's where the drive comes in. Now, we know throughout our schools, building a foundation for making change possible is critical. And it often is something that's very, very hard to replicate. Now, when I travel around the world, I see many, many examples, and I visit schools all over the world. And I go down corridors and see great practices, etc. And they're all happening all over the world. This year, I've actually started a journey called Daily Adventures. Many of the folks in this room have been part of this initiative. To get feedback from educators, teachers, students, leaders in the world of education who are often unsung for what they're doing. They're doing great work that often is happening inside a classroom door that no one in the world can see. We've got to celebrate these examples. They're all amongst us. They're in your countries, in your classrooms, in schools, and often don't get transferred from the wall between the classrooms. We've got to create a foundation for change to drive and sustain a broader success foundation. And this is true in every corridor and every school around the world. But the things that we have to value is not what we see on the surface, what the classroom looks like and the shape of the chairs and the direction that they're pointing or what type of devices people use. Making sustainable change possible is really rooted in three core things: people, process, and environment. And as we think about these three things, they will drive our conversations today and in the future. The people are our students, our teachers, the people that we're serving in the workforce and the community. Certainly the environment of the school is really what happens when I'm in the school, the language that supports the learning. And then process is often undersung, and this is a lot of what we'll discuss today, is how do we find a breadcrumb trail for driving change at a broader pace? Because scale is a global problem that all of us in this room face. We can certainly highlight and point to examples around the world, but those examples haven't fundamentally changed or shifted the landscape of education in a broad and certainly a broad way all over the world. So we've got to drive that foundation. Now, Microsoft has a foundation that looks at 10 critical success factors, everything from 21st century skills to thinking about leadership and creating a foundational vision to drive a foundation for change that can be lasting and scaled. And we'll talk about other implementations of a scaled roadmap that you can not only find and get to a higher level of change, but sustain it long term. And that's certainly a critical path to guide your focus. And we've been working in partnership with Intel and Cisco, and certainly members of this panel here, to drive a foundation for thinking about 21st century skills in a sustained way. And this project actually launched 3 years ago in this very forum to talk about and explore 21st century skills and its impact not only on education, but on assessment. And the work on ATC 21S is available to you at atc21s.org, and it creates a great foundation for thinking about how to bring skills into the classroom, and certainly relevant to our next speaker and panelist. So I'm very pleased to welcome a familiar face to many of you, and someone who has been leading the thinking of changing the foundation for how skills can not only land in the classroom, but be foundational to the way in which we assess student and school success. And he's been driving change around the world via his work at OECD and the work he's done with new initiatives like Talus. And I'd love to welcome Andreas Schleichner from OECD, Deputy Director from OECD. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks very much. Can I have my slides? We have really powerful data at the OECD, powerful evidence that the highly skilled never had the life chances they enjoy today. And even the financial crisis over the last years has made surprisingly very little difference to this. But at the low end of the skills spectrum, we are seeing rapidly deteriorating life chances of people. Without the right skills, people are kept on the margins of society. Technological progress doesn't translate into economic growth, and just countries can't compete in the 21st century. But more education doesn't automatically translate into better skills, better jobs, and better life. There is this toxic mix of unemployed graduates in our street, more and more, and at the very same time, employers telling us they cannot find the people with the skills they need. Look at Japan, country at the bottom. One of the most successful education systems in the world, and yet 80% of employers talk about recruitment difficulties. Or Egypt. You turn the television screen on and you see unemployed youth on the street, 1.5 million. But last year there were 600,000 vacancies that employers couldn't fill. That's the kind of challenges that we need to talk about. To succeed, we need to better understand what are those skills that actually drive outcomes. How can we teach those? How can we provide the right mix of skills in most equitable and efficient ways? How can we actually use those skills, bring them to bear in our economies? And last but not least, how can we think about much more creatively about who should pay for what, when, and how in education? To succeed with converting more education into better skills, we need to do these things, achieving quantity, quality, and impact in education. And if you actually look at how the demand for skills has changed, in the past, we could assume that what students learn in school is going to last for their lifetime. Today, education needs to fulfill very different. You can look up content on Google, where routine cognitive skills are being digitized and outsourced. Education is a lot more about ways of thinking, creativity, critical thinking, problem solving. It's about ways of working, communication, collaboration. Today, innovation is no longer about you having a great idea and actually doing it, but it's about you exchanging your knowledge with the knowledge of other people. And it's about ways, the tools of working, information technology obviously at the forefront of this. And the ultimate goal, of course, is to deliver skills for citizenship. Life and career, personal, social responsibility. And I'm not talking about introducing new school subjects into curricula. I don't think that's a very effective route. This has much to do with how we teach the most traditional school subjects. Take literacy as an example. In the past, literacy was about a set of technical skills you acquire once for a lifetime to extract a fixed body of knowledge from books. Today, literacy is about your capacity and motivation to identify, understand, interpret, create, communicate knowledge. The past It was sufficient to direct students to an encyclopedia to find the answers to the questions they were looking for. And they could actually believe those answers to be true. Today, again, you look it up on Google and you find 27,000 different answers. Literacy has become about curiosity and self-direction. It's about building your own synthesis of information, about dealing with ambiguity, about interpreting and resolving conflicting pieces of information. So it's not surprising that when you look at the demand for skills in the industrialized world, you can see actually amazing changes. You can see a decline in the demand for manual skills. Those jobs got automated and outsourced. But the steepest decline in skill demand is no longer in the area of manual skills, but in what we call routine cognitive skills. Memorizing something and expecting that that's going to save you later in your life. The dilemma for education is that the kind of things that are easiest to teach and easiest to test are also the kinds of things that are easiest to digitize, automate, and outsource, and therefore they are disappearing fastest from our labor markets. At the very same time, look at this chart. You can see an increase in the demand for non-routine analytical skills. This is not about reproducing established content knowledge, but about your capacity to extrapolate from that and to apply your knowledge in a novel situation. The kind of things that we're focusing when we test students in PISA. Developing those kind of skills requires very deep shifts in the ways in which we think about education. We still deal with education as a place. We worry about how we get children into schools. It's time to embrace that learning is an activity that engages, it starts from early childhood to throughout life, and that goes through everything that we do at any stage of our life. In the past, different students were taught in similar ways. Today, the challenge is to embrace diversity with differentiated pedagogical practice. The goal of the past was standardization, conformity, compliance. Today, it's about being ingenuous, about personalizing educational experiences, about understanding that ordinary students have extraordinary talents. The past was curriculum-centered. The future is learner-centered. Success also has to do with values. And values, I want to stress here, is not about resources. The money being spent on education only explains about 20% of the performance differences we see, at least in the industrialized world. The world is no longer divided in rich and well-educated countries and poor and badly educated ones. That's actually good news for many countries around here. But values has to do with the importance that we attach to education. Everybody, of course, agrees that education is important. Everybody's saying this. But the test comes when education is weighed against other priorities. How do countries pay their teachers compared with other highly skilled workers? Would you want your child to be a teacher rather than a lawyer? How do the media talk about learning and teachers? Well, we've learned from our PISA comparisons that leaders in successful education systems have convinced their citizens to make choices that value education, their future, more than consumption today. But placing a high value on education is just part of the equation. Another is the belief in the possibilities of every child to succeed. This chart shows you the performance of countries in PISA on the vertical axis and the impact which social background has on life chances, performance on the horizontal axis. So quality upwards, equity sideways. The upper right quadrant shows those countries that are able to combine high levels of performance with an equitable distribution of learning outcomes. And what you see here, that quality and equity and impact too are not exclusive policy goals. They can be combined. In Finland and in many Asian countries, parents and teachers are deeply committed that all students achieve high standards. Their schools have moved from providing excellence for some to providing excellence for all. And very interestingly, these beliefs, or these findings are mirrored in the beliefs of students. When we ask students in PISA what accounts for success in mathematics, in the United States, students typically tell us it's about talent. If I'm not born as a genius in mathematics, I better study something else. If you go to many of the East Asian countries, Japan or China, 9 out of 10 students say their success in mathematics depends on their own effort, and they trust their teachers to help them succeed. That tells you a lot about values in school systems. And importantly, our data also show that you can actually change this. In every part of the world, countries have been moving upwards and rightwards. Not everyone, but some. So what's behind achieving quality and impact? Modern school systems need to make learning central and encourage engagement. They need to foster lifelong skills-oriented learning instead of qualifications-focused education up front. They need to be highly attuned to students' motivations and acutely sensitive to individual differences. They need to provide an environment in which continual assessment, formative feedback. We should no longer think about assessment and teaching as two separate worlds. They need to become one. They need to fully capture the learning potential of every student. And you've seen on PISA, that is an achievable goal. Our data also show that skill development is far more effective if the world of learning and the world of work are integrated. Compared with purely government-designed curricula delivered exclusively in schools, learning in the workplace allows young people to develop hard skills on modern equipment and soft skills, teamwork, communication, collaboration, through real-world experience. Hands-on training learning also provides experiences for disengaged youth and to re-engage them with education and work. Here are some interesting data on this. On the vertical axis, you see the skills of people. On the horizontal axis, their age. And the red line shows you that if you're in school or university, you actually learn something. Skills go up. But the steepest growth in the acquisition of skills actually is for those who combine education and work. They start a bit lower, it's not the first choice of people, but they end up at a very, very strong point. Even the people who don't have the luxury to go to education, who just didn't work, can see growth in their skills. The only people in trouble are the people who are neither in education nor in work, for whom the equation here goes south. They end up worse than how they started. Modern schooling and learning environments also need to ensure that learning is collaborative. We spoke about this a lot today. And they need to promote connections across activities and subjects, both in and out of school. So how to get there? The answer is clear. Nowhere does the quality of a school system exceed the quality of its teachers, even with the best of technology. And there is no shortcut. And the road to success is tough. In old bureaucratic school systems, teachers were often left alone in classroom with a lot of prescription of what to teach. The most successful school systems, as measured by PISA, set very ambitious goals, are very clear about what good student performance looks like. But they provide their teachers with the tools they need to teach their students, to find out what their students need to learn. High performers also support their teachers to make innovations in pedagogy, to improve their performance, but also to improve the performance of their colleagues, and to pursue professional development that actually leads to stronger pedagogical practice. The goal of the past, again, was standardization and compliance. Today, it's about enabling teachers to be inventors. Finland, one of the world's top-performing school systems, has made teaching the most sought-after profession. They now get 10 applications for every post, despite average pay. They're very careful in whom they select and how they train them. They watch how they improve the performance of teachers who are struggling. And they provide an environment in which teachers work together to frame good practice. I asked Pasi Sahlberg, director of SIMO, about what keeps teaching in Finland so attractive. Listen to him.
The other schools that we have been able to keep teaching profession firstly intellectually attractive and interesting for teachers. In other words, that our teachers, they feel that they can use the knowledge and skills that they learn in teacher education fully. They have a role in curriculum planning and design. They have a very important role in assessing students' performance.
So teachers having a role in the education system. Singapore too has great aspirations for its teachers. Listen to how Professor Tan from Singapore's National Institute of Education defines teacher quality.
let me describe the philosophy behind our curriculum. First of all, we prepare a teacher to be first a teacher of the learner, number one, and number two, to be a good teacher of the subject. So the essential foundation is that a good teacher must first of all be very passionate and clear about how to help people learn and how people learn best.
Now you see, these are just two examples, but when you start to generalize and look across countries what high-performing systems share in their features, you see several things. First of all, of course, they make sure that teachers are well-versed in the subjects which they teach. That's obvious. But then also, their teachers have very solid training on how actually learning occurs. They master a broad range of learning strategies. And that's actually a lot easier said than done. We surveyed teachers around the world. And most teachers actually were able to describe quite well what good teaching looks like. Teachers do have a good sense of what good teaching looks like. But when you actually study what they actually do or what they say they do, as you can see here in the chart, you can see that the dominant model is still front-loaded, structured teaching, the dotted line here in this chart, while student-oriented teaching practices are a lot less common. And enhanced teaching activities, the kind of things we are talking about, is actually rare. But there are some good examples. In Finland, teacher candidates are deeply involved in educational practice from the outset. Teachers also need to write a research-based dissertation during their studies. And the idea is that teachers are expected to engage in disciplined inquiry in the classroom. Research, teaching are one of the same things. Janika Sarimo explained the Finnish approach to teacher education to me once like this.
So the teacher trainees need to have a certain amount of years of their subject learned at the university before they can enter the teacher training program. Teacher training for subject teachers lasts for a year, and so initially they start with theory. They are at the university for some weeks, then they come to us for a period of orientation where they meet their mentor teachers and they get to see the classrooms, and then there's a period during which they teach in pairs. After that, they go back to the university to get some more theory. They also have now some experience. They're able to maybe ask different questions because they have some experience from the practical side of things. And so it's kind of a wave back and forth between coming to get the practical side at the school and then going back to gain some more information regarding theory.
Teachers also need to have a deep understanding of how learning actually happens. And some of us used to think of Japan as a country where rote learning is dominant. And that may have been true in the past. But things are changing. Look at this data from our PISA test. You can see that OECD countries as a whole, the industrial world, improved a bit on traditional tasks and somewhat more on tasks requiring creative skills. So the world is moving in the direction of 21st century skills. Quite good. Huh? But then you look at Japan and you can actually see that they saw much more rapid growth than anyone else in students' independent thinking and problem solving over the last years. So you can see behind the scores that we usually see in tests, when you look at individual tests, you can actually see the 21st century agenda. Classroom practices, pedagogy is actually changing. This is what these data tell you. This is not about aggregate policies. This is about mentalities, mindsets of teachers actually changing. Teachers also need to reflect on their practices in order to learn from their experiences. Sweden is a great country. In Sweden, you see school principals every day challenging their teachers with questions like, how do we know that? Could we test another way of doing this? Or what do we know about how other people in other schools deal with the same problems? Teachers also need to work in highly collaborative works, working with other teachers, other professionals, within the same organization, in networks with other countries. Ontario has made such peer learning really systemic, trying to build on the good ideas that are already in the system instead of putting new ideas on top. Listen to how former Deputy Minister Levin describes this.
We placed a lot of emphasis on building on good things that were happening in the system. We started with the idea that there were lots of good things happening, and what we needed to do was scale those, have more people know about them, celebrate them, support them, and make them more widespread. And we certainly tried to create a feeling across the province that everyone was in it together.
And when I was in Singapore last year, I saw really fascinating examples of how professional learning communities actually operate. Listen to this.
To do that, really we get teachers to work together, to collaborate, and to look at each other's practice in the classroom. I think that is essential and really very critical, because the good teaching practices should not reside within the four walls and be kept to one teacher, and I think there is a lot of sharing that we can have in this school.
What you want to do right now is, okay, think of the Socratic question, okay, what do I want to use to further define, clarify? Now, okay, I will go on the internet, I will find any sort of evidence that will help support this statement or refute it.
Professional learning community in schools was started basically to ensure that teachers had a platform to develop their teaching practices. Our main focus actually is to make sure that students learn best. And in order to do that, we have to collaborate. We exchange ideas, we try out, we test, and eventually we check for results. And the intention really is to share ideas to make it better for the students.
And one thing is important, countries like Singapore, education in Singapore is not particularly expensive. It's actually quite modest in expense, but they made the right choice. They prioritized people, the environment, over the size of classes. You could see quite large class sizes. Teachers also need to focus, of course, on technologies, and that's both to optimize student learning, but also to track student learning. And it's also increasingly important that teachers have a real good understanding of how students actually live and socialize outside the classroom. The Learning Federation in Australia and New Zealand is a great example of how you can actually leverage centralized resources. Or once again, you can look to Singapore, how Singapore encourages innovation in teaching and flexible learning environments, with special emphasis on technology. Listen to this.
So we look at technology very meaningfully, and we see how can we leverage this technology to make a very significant impact in the classroom instruction. I'll give you an example. In a classroom of 40, it is really impossible to get 40 students to ask 40 questions at one go. When we use the instant messaging tool, we open 40 windows to 40 kids. They could ask 40 questions at the same time, and the teacher could see their thinking on the technology tool that they use. And kids get more excited because they are using the tools that they are very, very good in using, not just the pen and the pencil.
Right, everything consolidated on one PowerPoint slide. Use the main thing as a skeleton, then you add on to the different parts. Okay?
A lot of our younger teachers are coming in. They're a lot more savvy in the use of information, communication, technology tools. And I see them teaching the more senior teachers how to use those tools effectively.
And finally, teachers need to design and manage learning environments in collaboration with others. And I've seen that nowhere done more impressively than in Shanghai, in China. What they have achieved there is to attract the most talented teachers into the most challenging classrooms and to get the best principals into the toughest schools, to mobilize human resources. Listen to this.
那么如何来改变这种现状呢？我们就想到了，是不是能够把一些好的学校与相对困难的学校结成办学联合体呢？这个建议得到了我们教育行政部门，当然也得到了社区的广泛的认同与支持，于是我们就开展了这项工作。那么这项工作是怎么来做的呢？从政府来说，我们出台了相应的政策，就是鼓励与支持办学相对好的学校与相对困难的学校结成对子。第二呢，我们好的学校与相对困难的学校结成对子呢，我们要签订一个合作办学的协议。这个合作办学协议里面呢，就是明确了各自的责任、权利与义务。
We live in a world where even the best minister of education can no longer solve the problems of millions of students and hundreds of thousands of teachers. But if, like in the example of Shanghai, you actually can capitalize on what the knowledge of those great teachers is and bring them to bear in the entire system, you can actually change a lot. It's a tough agenda, and at the heart of this needs to be really research in a profession that is inspired by research and innovation. Think about it for a moment. The industrialized world spends currently more than 50 times more on medical research than on educational research, despite the fact that total public spending on education and health tend to be quite similar. There's also so much to gain from innovation and knowledge inspired by practitioners. And last but not least, we should make a lot better use of the potential for innovation through firms, entrepreneurial development, new products, services, all the kind of things we're going to talk about here. The bottom line, what does it all mean? In the past, when we only needed a small slice of well-educated workers, it was sufficient and perhaps efficient for governments to focus education on a small elite. But the social and economic cost of low performance has become so huge that the best performance systems now get all young people to succeed in education, which is what you see on the PISA test. When you could still assume that what you learn in school is going to last for your lifetime. Teaching content, routine cognitive skills, were good at the center of education. Today, where routine cognitive skills are being digitized and outsourced, and where jobs are changing so rapidly, schools need to enable young people to become lifelong learners, to manage complex ways of thinking, complex ways of working that computers won't take over easily. And that requires a very different caliber of teachers. When teaching was about explaining prefabricated content, you could actually tolerate low teacher quality. And when teacher quality was low, governments tended to tell their teachers exactly what they should be doing and exactly how they want to get it done. But today, this will not work anymore. In the most advanced systems, governments have made teaching a highly educated, knowledge-based profession. That's what the future has looked like. But then, people who see themselves as candidates for the profession are not attracted by schools organized as assembly lines with teachers working as exchangeable widgets. So it has to do with the kind of work organization and environment that we need to provide. The final point I want to make is to keep looking upwards. 2 generations ago, the United States was #1 on almost any educational indicator that we have. Today, the United States is an average performer. Not because standards have fallen, but because they have risen so much faster elsewhere. Korea shows you what's possible. 2 generations ago, Korea had the standard of living of Afghanistan today, one of the least developed education systems. Today, every young person gets a decent education. People sometimes say that changing educational administrations is like moving graveyards. You can't just rely on the people out there in front to help you. But the world has really become indifferent to tradition and practice. Success is no longer an option. And success goes to those school systems that are swift to adapt. What international comparisons show us that's actually possible. Thank you very much.
That was a great foundation, thinking about the range of not only lifelong learning, but 21st century skills, and certainly its importance as it relates to not only the teaching environment, but the relevant experience that learning and education provides to students. And as I reflected earlier around student expectations and having students walk into a classroom expecting more for their future, I can't think of a better speaker than Dr. Russell Quaglia, who leads the Quaglia Institute for Student Aspirations, to join us to share his thoughts on the issue of what drives success.
Thank you. Can I borrow the, thank you. Good afternoon. It's truly an honor or privilege to speak with you today. And what's a real challenge for me, I used to have one challenge, now I have 2. One is the challenge of following Andreas when he just told you that Americans were now average. I'm going to try to rise above that right now, actually. And my second challenge was to take 30 years of my research, my writings, and my theories and put it into 15 minutes. I am proud to say I'm going to be able to do that. What I'm not so proud of is, now that I can do it, I'm not sure that makes me happy or really sad that I can talk about my entire life's work in 15 minutes. Nonetheless, we're going to give it a go. What I want to share with you, in some real simple terms, quite frankly, is what I think we need to do together to have students reach their potential. I'm going to share with you data from over 500,000 students, 500,000. And finally, I'm going to share with you some of the implications and I believe the possibilities we can do together to move forward. When I talk with students and policymakers and educators, I try to talk about success really in two dimensions. I talk about a dreaming dimension, and I talk about doing. I know there are lots and lots of variables that go into success. But the more and more I work with students, the more and more I work with teachers in various countries, I've come to the realization it's about dreaming and it's about doing. And there are some students that we work with that are low doers and low dreamers. They're in the hibernation state. They don't cause any trouble, they're just there. Then we have another group of students, high dreamers, low doers. They're in the imagination state. These are the students we love to be with because they're going to tell us, don't worry, I'll make sure it gets done. These are the staff members that we don't mind hanging around with because they too will tell us, I'll get it done, don't worry. I talk to students that want to be doctors, that want to be lawyers, that want to be teachers, but don't particularly like going to school. I talk to students that want to attend universities, but haven't found the time to apply yet. It's almost through divine intervention they will become successful. In the bottom right-hand corner, I have the doers, the people that come to school on time, work really, really hard, the teachers that are dedicated to doing their best, but aren't sure about their futures. They're not sure about what they're doing next week, the next class, never mind in the next year or two. When I look at those three categories, I ask you, where do you fall? Where does your country fall? Where do your students fall? Because together what we need to do is to take those three categories and move them in the upper right quadrant of aspirations. Aspirations, the ability to think and dream about the future, but be inspired in the present to get there. It's a pretty simple formula. The challenge, though, is how do we take those quadrants, those three areas, and move them into aspirations? We've identified three components that are making a difference. And what's interesting about these three components, this isn't something we made up in the shower. It's not some idea we had riding the tube. It's through 30 years of research and documentation and trying to sort out what really makes a difference for students as well as staff. The first guiding principle is self-worth. It's having students believe in themselves. It's having staff believe they can be successful. I hear all the time the issue of the achievement gap. My experience, in schools, we have an expectation gap. When people ask me what do I think the biggest issue is in American education, I talk about the expectation gap. When students' expectations are higher of themselves than the teacher expectations are of students, that's a problem. The next guiding principle is engagement. Having students meaningfully engaged in the learning, knowing why they're learning something that's important to them. I know I go back to the achievement gap. When I deal with engagement, I'm talking about a participation gap, where students are not connected to the learning, when teachers aren't even connected to the teaching. And last but not least, purpose, the notion of purpose. What are we doing in our countries to have students think beyond themselves, to realize this is not about me, but this is about a greater whole? I want to share with you some data now from over 500,000 students around self-worth. This comes from an instrument called My Voice, and we survey students from all over. And there's 83 items on the instrument. I'm going to share with you just a half a dozen to share with you the power of listening to students. 45% of the students say I'm a valued member of my school community. 50% of the kids say teachers care if I'm absent from school. 50% say my teacher cares if I'm absent from school. I suggest to you, before we worry about new technology, new curriculum, we need to show the kids that we care, that they show up. 58% of the students say I'm proud of my school. What's interesting about this data? The same students that say I feel valued are the same students that say my teacher cares if I'm absent, and are the same students who are proud of their school. This is not magic. It's common sense. And in education, common sense has been trumped by common practice. When I think about engagement, 45% of the students we surveyed say school is boring. Here's what's interesting about that. That's not news to anyone. Everyone says, oh yeah. To me, the news is we don't find that appalling. Maybe it's because only 45% say, my classes help me understand what's happening in my everyday life. 45%. You know what's unbelievable about that number? That number gets higher the longer students are in school. When we survey the 12-year-olds, that's around 60%. By the time that they're ready to graduate, it's 40%. 34% of the teachers know my hopes and dreams. How do we expect students to be meaningfully engaged in their learning if only 34% think you know who I am? That's common sense. The sense of purpose, this is the good news. 94% of the students believe they're going to be successful. The not so good news, only 76% of the teachers believe they're going to be successful. That's the expectation gap. When we talk about student voice, something that obviously is near and dear to my heart, we ask the students, do you have a voice in decision-making at your school? It's the piece that Andreas alluded to earlier. It's students owning, being responsible, believing in themselves and their school. Only 44% have a voice in decision-making. Do you know why that is? Because 52% say teachers are willing to learn from students. When I go into schools, when I meet with different policymakers, here's rule number one. Students have something to teach us. Students have something to teach us. Rule number two, students are the potential, they're not the problem. As we go back to this, and I know I went through my data very quickly, what I wanted to make sure is that you understand that this was not a quick survey. I have all the psychometric measures that the researchers in this room certainly can have access to, and I would love for you to learn from. But I wanted to give you a snapshot of 3 guiding principles in student voice that I believe can lead to success for schools. What are the implications that I see? The first, and again, Andreas, and I'm sure Vicky will talk about this as well, we need to capitalize on our greatest resource. And our greatest resource, with all due respect from all these sponsors, is not technology. Our greatest resource is the student. There's lots of them. Do we take advantage of students? Do we listen? They're the ones that fill us with the passion to get up in the morning. They're the ones that we fly from all over the world to be here to learn about. I say take advantage of them and involve them in the process. The second thing is around student voice. It needs to be inclusive. It needs to be inclusive. For so long, I hear people say, oh, the student voice, what a nice idea. No, that's not a nice idea. Student voice needs to be an active ingredient. It needs to be part of the process. It can't be like, I think we'll add student voice because I heard somebody speak about it. What are we doing to ensure students have a voice? The third component, and a lesson that I've learned, it only matters if people are willing to listen. We work in lots and lots of places now, and they think they're pretty progressive because they ask students what they think. But they don't do anything with the information. I would tell you we do more harm than good asking students what they think and don't do anything than if we never ask them at all. Students expect to be heard, they expect to be asked, and they expect action to take place. Last but not least, student voice leads to aspirations, and to me, better teaching, and ultimately what we're all in this room for is achievement. I'm proud to say, aside from the work we do with the Institute for Student Aspirations, we now have schools in the UK with the Aspirations Academy Trust. And what makes that a little different is because we have individualized learning plans for every student. Every student has a plan. And when I share that with teachers, I get, really? And I said, do you want to hear what's even more amazing? You're going to have one too. Every teacher has an individualized learning plan. Every administrator has an individualized learning plan. Every person on our board will have an individualized learning plan because we're all in this together. We believe in the importance of teacher evaluation, but it's not just the content. It's ensuring that it has self-worth, engagement, and purpose. I have reached my 15 minutes, and I want to leave you with just one last thing. One of the things that keeps me going is I never lose sight of the target. And together we can't. We need to believe over these next 2 days that wonderful surprises are waiting to happen. And all the hopes and dreams we have for our students, all the hopes and dreams we have for our students are well within our reach. Thank you. Godspeed. Thanks. Thank you.
Well, certainly I couldn't agree more with those first two presentations, and I think the next presenter will help us not only take the ideas and the methodologies and approaches, both on skills and student voice, but a foundation for driving broad change through our countries, through policy work, and the work our next presenter has done in that has been instrumental. She is the founder and director of Fundación Escuela Nueva, and I'm pleased to welcome Vicky Colbert to join us.
Thank you, Anthony. Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you so much for the organizers for giving me the opportunity to share with you the story of Escuela Nueva, one of the longest bottom-up innovations of the developing world. I think right now that has still been sustained. I think right now Escuela Nueva is like the grandmother of many of inspirations and innovations that are running around the world. It's also a big challenge to talk after Andreas and Professor Russell, who so smartly presented and documented all these challenges of education. But coming from the other extreme, from the margins of society, when we started Escuela Nueva in rural Colombia more than 30 years ago, it's an opportunity to reinforce the validity of many of the ideas that they have presented, so well documented and validated. Coming from, again, the margins of society, it's an opportunity to really demonstrate that the story of Escuela Nueva, whose design, implementation, testing for so many years on the ground, identified and took into account many of the important things that you have mentioned. So just coming from the other extreme. I wanted to leave 5 messages. Is it here that I can just, sorry. With this, yeah.
The green button.
Yeah. I wanted to leave 5 key messages or takeaways for you. Yes, it is possible to improve the quality of education, particularly in low-income schools in developing countries. Yes, it is possible. Second, more of the same is not enough. We require a paradigm shift, a new learning paradigm. Third, to do this, we have to think systemically. If we want to have changes in children and youth, we require changes in the way of training the teachers, changes in the way of relating with the parents and the communities, and changes with the administration. Fourth, learning should go beyond academic achievements. Right now, everybody's talking about 21st century skills, but we also should be talking about peaceful democratic behavior. That's extremely important. Peaceful social interaction in schools. For all the things I'm saying, I have proven evidence. And fifth, technology is extremely important. It triggers change, but a new pedagogy is indispensable for effective learning. This is very, very important. I want to start with this quote that for me has been quite inspirationally. And let me just, you can read it. For more than 100 years, the lack of school management methods has been the cost of countless complaints, but it's only in the last 30 years that efforts have been made to find a solution. And what has resulted? Schools continue exactly the same as before. Who said it? Comenius in the year 1600. My main message here is that everything has changed except the way of learning. We know education systems are not changing as fast as the rest of the components of society. And this is very crucial. But for us that, frequently people are pessimistic about the possibility of making transformational changes in society and large scale. However, our experience is different. All of us that have been committed to Escuela Nueva Life Project, it's a collective life project, we have witnessed that it can be possible to transform learning environments massively. And this can be done, and it works. Escuela Nueva basically, it provides a cost. We had to think of costs. It's a local innovation that started in the mid-70s. It became a national policy in Colombia, reaching more than 20,000 schools at the end of the 80s. It was a local innovation becoming a national policy, and it provides a cost-effective, replicable, scalable solution. It's a pedagogical reform. And once the World Bank selected it in 1989 as one of the 3 innovations that had impacted successfully national policies, we got a lot of countries coming into Colombia. More than 40 countries have come to be inspired in the experience. And it has been adapted to many countries, mainly in Latin America, through the governments. Brazil, Escola Activa, Guatemala, Dominican Republic, Panama, and now just recently, East Timor. Just recently, I was talking to the delegation from Vietnam. Vietnam has taken the decision to take it to scale to both rural and urban schools. And right now, we're working in Mexico. So it has been one of the innovations that have been very formally evaluated and has been consistent, demonstrating results, not only in learning achievement, but in peaceful democratic behavior. And this is extremely important coming out of Colombia. This was published by the University of London in 2006, the impact of Escuela Nueva on peaceful social interaction of children. And I think a UNESCO study in 1998 demonstrated when Escuela Nueva was well implemented at the country level, Colombia was the only country after Cuba where rural schools outperformed urban schools, except of megacities. But this is extremely important. However, once we scaled up, I started Escuela Nueva with a team of local innovation. I then became Vice Minister of Education, but when I left, I said, oh my God, innovations are too vulnerable to political and administrative changes. So we created a Colombian NGO, Fundación Escuela Nueva is a Colombian NGO, because we learned that unless you have public-private partnerships, we work with the coffee growers, we work with the petroleum company in Colombia. Now civil society, unless you engage the 3, innovations will not be sustained. Okay, so as I said before, with this Comenius inspiring quote, just one more thing. I heard somebody years back say, if we brought a doctor from the health sector into a hospital today, from 100 years back into a hospital today, this doctor would be lost in a totally different world. If we brought a teacher from 100 years back into a classroom today, the teacher would feel sort of at home, not so many problems. So it really demonstrates the essence of challenging the conventional model. Escuela Nueva really represents a thorough revisioning and reorganization of the conventional model of learning. It also demonstrated that teachers were not an obstacle to be a fundamental social change. On the contrary, there's a thesis of Michael Gravel, who now works at the World Bank, and he did this public policy document in Harvard saying that's one of the reforms where the children, teachers, and communities are the agents and actors of change. So this is another key message. So we need a paradigm shift. Improving the quality of education implies more than an emphasis on expanding current education systems. More of the same is not enough. It implies a cultural change, shift from a teacher-driven pedagogy, from transmission of information to an emphasis in collective and social construction of knowledge. A new type of school, renovated teaching methods. So we had to rethink everything, the way of learning and the basic education system. But of course, as I said, we're already like a grandmother. We did this 30 years ago. So Escuela Nueva, what does it do? It transforms the conventional school and way of learning from frontal, teacher-centered instruction into child-centered participatory learning. What does it promote? These images, by the way, are not new in the philosophy of education. We know the philosophy of education for over 100 years. But usually these principles come into elite schools. Many of you in the audience are probably familiarized with all this if you go to private schools. But this is not the case of the low-income schools in developing countries. So the principles are not new, but we managed to put them all together in a very systemic way so that any teacher could transform the learning environment. This is extremely important because we managed to translate complexity into manageable action. So a teacher without having a PhD can have results. This is extremely important for us because these are the teachers we work with in the developing world. When I came back from doing my studies in Stanford many, many years ago, I found in the schools of Colombia no results, like a failed company. No results, dropout, repetition, nothing worked. Ineffective teacher training, 2 or 3 hours effective time on reading, traditional methods, teacher-centered methods, no good quality materials in the classroom. But we tackled all these things systemically instead of tackling each one in isolation. This is extremely important. Not everybody learns the same thing at the same time. We started in the margins of society with the rural multi-grade schools. I want to highlight the importance of a book published by the University of London, Angela Little, who say, many of the outcomes for the Millennium Goals will not be achieved unless we look at these schools where we started off at the margins. Multi-grade schools are invisible to most educational planners, but they're an entry point for innovation. They exist in both developed and developing countries. They handle heterogeneity and diversity in the classroom. So for us, this was the starting point for us to introduce a radical change. Different learning systems, we introduced flexible delivery systems, flexible promotion. Not everybody finishes learning the same thing at the same time and can finish academic units at their own pace. Relevance is key, very important, so children can be motivated. It has to be relevant and meaningful. We talked about a new role of the teacher 30 years ago. A new role of the teacher as a facilitator, somebody that spends more time motivating, catalyzing, not just a transmitter of instruction, and having more time for formative evaluation. So this is very important. Teacher training doesn't work so much. A lot of money has gone in, so we had to change the way of doing it. Experiential teacher training methodologies, using the same methodologies we would use with the children. Networks, microcenters, or learning circles so that we can have network and collaboration among teachers. This was extremely important. Anything that child learns has to be applied to the school and the community. This is extremely important for us. And democracy, how to nurture, how to learn. What John Dewey said 80 years ago, we have applied it in many of the schools, nurturing democratic and participatory values and active citizenship. And we developed a new generation of interactive, self-paced, self-directed, reusable learning guides, like a hybrid of a textbook that incorporates both content and methodology. This can be enhanced a lot with new technologies. This is extremely important. Learning guides that promote individual work, cooperative work, promoting interaction, dialogue. The essence of Escuela Nueva is children learn through dialogue and interaction, constructing knowledge together. Local materials, low cost-effective materials, but that change and improve the learning environments. So Escuela Nueva has generated a new culture of peace and citizenship, allowing boys and girls to learn and participate in empowering them and their communities. Now, many of these images can be also done with adults and with youth. We're now working with adults and youth in Colombia. It has a systemic approach, curriculum, teacher training, school community, and administration, and we have tried to impact national policies. I saw this in a newspaper of Colombia in year 2003. We need individuals who can work in teams. So you have the ability to solve problems, follow instructions, lead processes, meet deadlines, and most important, working groups. If the answer is yes, you have a better opportunity to get a job. So this was already the entry point for the 21st century skills that everybody's talking about right now, and education systems were not producing this. So what we started basically to solve a problem of access and quality, we ended up in cutting-edge pedagogics, constructivist theories applied in low-income schools. So the essence of Escuela Nueva is personalized and cooperative learning are the essential for the 21st century skills. They are the essence of Escuela Nueva. None of us is as smart as all of us together. And I'm quoting Professor François Tadei from Descartes University in Paris, who's trying to change the French system, but that we're working together precisely because we can show that it can be done, and it can be done a scalable and replicable way. Thank you so much.
I want to thank our panelists, and let's give them a round of applause again for their remarks. Now, I do believe we have a little bit of time for questions, so I think there are mics being passed around, so if those who have questions, just raise your hand to find a mic will be brought to you. Questions? We have a question? Yes. It's hard to see.
My mistake.
Yes.
First of all, good evening. My name is Salman al-Mizjaji. I came from Yemen. Actually, talking about the now time and the then time. And actually, I think most of the attendants agree with me that most of us live in the then time more than the now time. So sometimes we feel that the person who spoke in the first, I'm sorry, I don't remember your name, but talking about the then time and the now time, we want to compromise actually between them. My question is, which is about the motto of the forum itself, policy making for quantity, quality, and impact. Quantity and quality, for us it's very, I'm talking about myself, the ministry I work for, Yemen, and the developing world. Quantity and quality sometimes are very difficult to compromise, to the extent that sometimes we say that they are mutually exclusive. I don't know whether you agree with me or what. The question is how to compromise and to use the impact as the yardstick to, just to qualify and compromise between quantity and quality. This is just my question. Thank you.
It's a tough question. I think quantity, quality, equity, those are clearly different policy objectives, but they can be well aligned. If you look over the last 10 years what Brazil has achieved, getting a lot more young people into secondary school and at the very same time raising quality. Or if you look at Korea over longer periods of time, they had very few people in the 1950s in school at all. And they were able to actually get more people into school and raise quality. If you look across the world, what those countries have done, first, they've got the right standards. They've basically created an ambition that every child needs to be in education, needs to have a high quality education. They had very little resources. They have prioritized them well. They have prioritized the quality of instruction, the quality of teaching over things like the size of classes and infrastructure. Very, very interesting examples. You know, when you look at what actually drives learning outcomes, there's very little evidence on things like, physical infrastructure and class size. A lot of influence on the quality of instruction, quality of teaching, the kind of work organization you provide for your teachers. So I can't give you a clear-cut answer, but what I can show you is there have been a fair number of countries that have been very, very good at raising quantity, getting more children into school, and at the very same time moving quality upwards. If you just get more children into school without raising quality, you're not doing anyone a great service. Unfortunately, there are also a lot of examples of that nature. I think look towards the positive countries. I think in the last 10 years, in our data, Brazil is the most powerful one. But if you look over longer periods of time, China, Korea, fascinating results too.
Something very important is the collaboration between sectors. When we started in Colombia 30 years back, the country was not offering complete primary education at that moment. So with Escuela Nueva, we managed to reach complete primary education. But we had to challenge the whole system, as I mentioned, with the Escuela Nueva model. It became a national policy, but then the crucial challenge is not reaching access and coverage or quality, is how to sustain it. These are the key issues. So for this, once we scaled up, then we had to scale down and create an NGO, like the one I'm heading, to continue pushing the governments at all levels. And also, the public-private partnerships are essential. If we had not done a collaboration with the coffee growers of Colombia, with the petroleum company of Colombia, they came into the picture to help sustain when the government forgot about Escuela Nueva at the end of the 90s. So you need to have all these different actors coming together. And I can say it because I've been in all the sectors. And the key issue is persistence. In education, things take time because you're working with attitudes and behaviors. So you have to have a lot of persistence. And because usually political, innovations are very vulnerable to political changes and administrative changes. So the issue is to have other actors coming into the picture. This is crucial, the collaboration for change.
Can I just, sure. The only piece I would add to that as well, which complements those two, is to build that sustainability comes with creating internal capacity. So it's bringing people from the outside in to help us learn, but then it's taking some control over that, because where I see the quality and quantity growing is when organizations have internal capacity to keep it going themselves, and they're not reliable on the outside all the time. So it's that combination of the both, between the quality and the quantity, but also sustainability and capacity.
Great, thank you. Other questions? Yes.
Good evening. I'm Suhad Abdelrazik from Sudan. I really impressed by the presentation that has been presented this night. I think we all agree that the education it is a process which starts with initial input and end with initial output. And also, I think from all the presentation, we agree that in this process, there are many partners who are sharing with us as policymakers the education process. Beneficiaries, teachers, communities, parents, governments, all these are partners and has to come all together to agree on the maximum satisfaction of them from the education process. But I think also we all agree the main player in this process and main component of this process of education is the teachers. And the program of the teachers in the education colleges has to be also under focus and under direction, so that we can teach the teachers the things that can make the education process very efficient and very satisfaction for all the partners, and we can produce the skills for the market labor or for the good nations by this a long time of process of education in all system of education around the world. Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. The quality of an education system can never be better than the quality of its teachers. But I think we also have to be careful how we raise the quality of the teaching force. And initial teacher education is important, but if the focus ends there, it's not going to be sufficient. What is a lot more important, actually, is the kind of career opportunities that teachers have who are in the profession, the opportunities they have for professional development, how teachers learn from and with other teachers, the kind of professional communities that we build. If sort of teaching is just one monolithic profession, you know, you educate new teachers, you get them into schools, you leave them alone, education is unlikely to improve. So building sort of these teacher careers, these opportunities to actually move the profession forward, which we're seeing in many other professions actually a lot better. I think that's really what is central to this.
I'll just add, I think Russell made a great statement with students are the potential, not the problem. I can add that to teachers to that list. Teachers are the heroes in this equation, not the problem. In many cases, we need to do a better job of uplifting our great teachers, really celebrating the profession of teaching and celebrating the pivotal role teachers play in driving that change. So I agree, it's a critical thing to celebrate and support, and we have to do a better job of that.
One of the interesting things that we've learned with the instrument that we use is I shared with you student data. We have the exact same data for teachers, and what's interesting when we survey the teachers, they too do not have a high level of self-worth. They too do not feel meaningfully engaged in what they're teaching. And the one that strikes me the most, quite frankly, is the sense of purpose, where they don't understand their role as an educator. And what's fascinating, and Andres just and I shared with us seconds ago, this is broad sweeping strokes. When you're surveying 500,000 people, there's some broad strokes out there. What's interesting, when there's high self-worth, engagement, and purpose from the teachers, there's high self-worth, engagement, and purpose for the students, which leads to schools that have incredibly high achievement levels.
We sort of had to compensate for what faculties of education are not doing in Latin America and in Colombia. A lot of theory, but very little practice. So we had to bring a community of teachers together, the same principle of cooperative learning that we used for the students. So we created these learning circles, which are a network of teachers, because it's a teacher-to-teacher strategy. That has been more successful than the theory in faculties of education, at least of our Latin American faculties of education. So this has been a tremendous empowering of teachers.
I think we have time for one last question. I may try to squeeze one in while we're waiting, so raise your hand and get a mic, but I want to ask Russell a question on student voice. It strikes me as a very powerful resource we have in our schools to have students be part of not only what they want for their own future, but their future of education and what's going on in the schools. What are best practices or ideas that you can share with the group on how to get the voice of students in a meaningful way to drive change and affect a sustainable shift in our schools?
Without self-promoting, I think one of the ways, and this is pretty simple, is to ask and to really listen. One of the pieces that really has become the linchpin with our work is this notion of hopes and dreams. We're teaching students the material, which is fine. We need to teach material. But until we can make that connection to the student why they're learning this material, very simply, talk to them about their hopes and dreams. Not looking if they're coming to class on time, albeit I understand the importance of all those kinds of things. But the vehicle that we're using to reach the students is getting at a level that they really know that we're listening to them. And by listening to them, I don't mean giving away the farm here. What I'm talking about is adjusting what we're doing, making connections, and it's all about making connections. Victor, when you were talking, this notion of student learning and connections, and the vehicle I see using is asking, be very systematic in that approach, that this doesn't become an add-on, and then taking that data, sharing it with the students, because the other interesting thing about the data, it's not just for you, it's for the students to reflect back. One question we ask the students, do you come to school prepared to learn? Do you come to school prepared to learn? The majority of students that we surveyed say no. That's not a teaching issue, that's a student issue. But we got to get that out on the table and have some real dialogue.
Giving voice to the students. There are many simple ways of doing it, and it doesn't sound revolutionary. We organize student governments, which is nothing new, and children are organized in committees, and they take initiatives, they take leadership, they solve their community problems. So it's just learning how to introduce very simple mechanisms that any teacher can do it to simply give voice to the learner.
And the issue there is a fear factor. We've got to not be afraid to do it, because people are afraid. And I think by doing the things that Vicky talks about in some other ways, it's just giving up some of the fear.
Well, I don't see another question. I know, oh, we have one more? Yes, please.
Excuse me. Hello? Over here.
Oh, sorry.
My name is Anjimide Ntira Oponyo. I am from Malawi. The first guest speaker, spoke about the challenges of implementation in the modern world. Now, we have a huge dilemma in Malawi. We have just got a new president, and there's so much political will to do well in education. And the budget for education was increased. Mostly we talk about the budget in developing countries being too low. But in this particular case, money allocated for education was increased. But we are not able to absorb the money. Last year, Minister of Education had to give back the money. I want to hear from other countries, other examples of how you moved from, okay, having the political will and having the resources, having the donors support you positively, but how do you get it down to the teacher in the classroom and for that child in the classroom to feel the impact? How do you get there? We are tackling with that problem, but we're not making very good progress because we gave back money last year, and I am now the principal secretary, and I don't want to see the same situation where we don't have classrooms, we don't have teachers' houses, teachers are miserable, they are unmotivated, but you don't have the systems to implement to get down to the ground. Thank you.
I think a bottom-up process is very important. Top-down, decree-driven reforms don't work very much. At least that's our experience. So if we have innovations running around many schools that are making changes, they are extremely important because you start disseminating these innovations bottom-up, and you promote a demand-driven approach from the teachers themselves. So all of a sudden you have, even if it's not in the Ministry of Education, which is ideal, but it's so important to have bottom-up processes and results to show. That's extremely important, and to maintain it.
Well, I certainly think one of the things that I certainly are concerned about, sort of money that's on the table from a government typically, is often it leads to short-term spending as opposed to foundational change that's sustaining, as you pointed out. And I think the critical risk is not to figure out how to spend a pocket of money rashly without leading to a broader foundational change that has many, many years in scope, and years in which the funding may not be as stable as it is in this current year. And that foundation is rooted on what we want for our schools, what foundation we expect for our teachers, and then a longer vision that both can be inclusive of the society. So bringing teachers, parents, community leaders, as well as businesses into the project in a longer-term foundation is critical. And establishing that vision from the top by getting support and feedback from all those players is critical, and then exposing it, sharing it, bringing parents into the loop and saying, here's where we're working, and then actually allowing the spend that's being done in the short term to accrue to a larger agenda. Because too often one of the things I think we have is spend that happens for projects. We're going to buy 10,000 laptops, or we're going to wire classrooms, et cetera. And there's no pervasive connection that all these projects are rooted on. And then when funding drives away in a specific year, the plan doesn't sustain because there isn't a mission that everyone has been having a plan for or a stake involved to drive change. So I think that's critical as we think about these environments. Well, anyway, I want to thank everyone for joining us and your input, and thanks everyone for joining this panel. Well, it is actually an honor and a great pleasure to be with all of you today. This is an incredibly important time and a critical meeting for the world, for all of your children. We certainly know learning is changed. It has changed. It has changed for your citizens, your people, certainly your students and families. What hasn't changed, or at least hasn't changed as much, is education, our schools, our foundation for our institutions to support the learning that has changed around our students and our families' lives. And it's critical for us to not only bridge that gap, but do so quickly as we face not only great conversations today, but great change and potential change in the future. And that's what this is about. I love the fact that this plenary session and the plenary sessions have been designed around questions. What drives success? And in many ways, the questions we ask in education, and as we go about embracing the change potential that is before us, are far more important than the actions that we take. In many cases, rooting our progress, our success in rich questions will drive us forward. So asking a question, what drives success, is perfect. First off, let's look at success. Defining what success means is critical. And I often get asked as I travel around the world, what is a successful school to you? What does a successful school look like? And it's hard for me to define that easily because I know it when I see it. But typically it comes face to many of you and someone who has been leading the thinking of changing the foundation for how skills can not only land in the classroom, but be foundational to the way in which we assess student and school success. And he's been driving change around the world via his work at OECD and the work he's done with new initiatives like Talus. And I'd love to welcome Andreas Schleichner from OECD, Deputy Director from OECD. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks very much. Can I have my slides? We have really powerful data at the OECD, powerful evidence that the highly skilled never had the life chances they enjoy today. And even the financial crisis over the last years has made surprisingly very little difference to this. But at the low end of the skills spectrum, we are seeing rapidly deteriorating life chances of people. Without the right skills, people are kept on the margins of society. Technological progress doesn't translate into economic growth. And just countries can't compete in the 21st century. But more education doesn't automatically translate into better skills, better jobs, and better life. There is this toxic mix of unemployed graduates in our street, more and more, and at the very same time, employers telling us they cannot find the people with the skills they need. Look at Japan, country at the bottom. One of the most successful education systems in the world, and yet 80% of employers talk about recruitment difficulties. Or Egypt. You turn the television screen on and you see unemployed youth on the street, 1.5 million. But last year there were 600,000 vacancies that employers couldn't fill. That's the kind of challenges that we need to talk about. To succeed, we need to better understand what are those skills that actually drive outcomes. How can we teach those? How can we provide the right mix of skills in most equitable and efficient ways? How can we actually use those skills, bring them to bear in our economies? And last but not least, how can we think about much more creatively about who should pay for what, when, and how in education? To succeed with converting more education into better skills, we need to do these things, achieving quantity, quality, and impact in education. And if you actually look at how the demand for skills has changed, in the past we could assume that what students learn in school is going to last for their lifetime. Today, education needs to fulfill very different. You can look up content on Google, where routine cognitive skills are being digitized and outsourced. Education is a lot more about ways of thinking, creativity, critical thinking. problem solving. It's about ways of working, communication, collaboration. Today, innovation is no longer about you having a great idea and actually doing it, but it's about you exchanging your knowledge with the knowledge of other people. And it's about ways, the tools of working, information technology obviously at the forefront of this. And the ultimate goal, of course, is to deliver skills for citizenship, life and career, personal, social responsibility.
It comes back to one basic thing. The kids in the school, the children in the school, expect a big future ahead for themselves. And that's not often easy to achieve. It's one of the things that we often undervalue. And when students walk into a classroom, do they expect more from their future? When they walk into the school, do they feel powered to make change possible, to have a bigger role in their communities, with their families, in their country, and in the world? And we've got to embrace our school systems to create an engine for success. And that's where the drive comes in. Now, we know throughout our schools, building a foundation for making change possible is critical. And it often is something that's very, very hard to replicate. Now, when I travel around the world, I see many, many examples, and I visit schools all over the world. And I go down corridors and see great practices, etc. And they're all happening all over the world. This year, I've actually started a journey called Daily Adventures. Many of the folks in this room have been part of this initiative, to get feedback from educators, teachers, students, leaders in the world of education who are often unsung for what they're doing. They're doing great work that often is happening inside a classroom door that no one in the world can see. We've got to celebrate these examples. They're all amongst us. They're in your countries, in your classrooms and schools, and often don't get transferred from the wall between the classrooms. We've got to create a foundation for change to drive and sustain a broader success foundation. And this is true in every corridor and every school around the world. But the things that we have to value is not what we see on the surface, what the classroom looks like and the shape of the chairs and the direction that they're pointing or what type of devices people use. Making sustainable change possible is really rooted in three core things: people, process, and environment. And as we think about these three things, they will drive our conversations today and in the future. The people are our students, our teachers, the people that we're serving in the workforce and the community. Certainly the environment of the school is really what happens when I'm in the school, the language that supports the learning. And then process is often undersung, and this is a lot of what we'll discuss today, is how do we sustain, find a breadcrumb trail for driving change at a broader pace? Because scale is a global problem that all of us in this room face. We can certainly highlight and point to examples around the world, but those examples haven't fundamentally changed or shifted the landscape of education in a broad, and certainly a broad way all over the world. So we've got to drive that foundation. Now, Microsoft has a foundation that looks at 10 critical success factors, everything from 21st century skills to thinking about leadership and creating a foundational vision to drive a foundation for change that can be lasting and scaled. And we'll talk about other implementations of a scaled roadmap that you can not only find and get to a higher level of change, but sustain it long term. And that's certainly a critical path to guide your focus. And we've been working in partnership with Intel and Cisco, and certainly members of this panel here, to drive a foundation for thinking about 21st century skills in a sustained way. And this project actually launched 3 years ago in this very forum to talk about and explore 21st century skills and its impact not only on education, but on assessment. And the work on ATC 21S is available to you at atc21s.org, and it creates a great foundation for thinking about how to bring skills into the classroom, and certainly relevant to our next speaker and panelist. So I'm very pleased to welcome a familiar